This video is going to reveal to you step-by-step guides on how to cut this dress that you are seeing in this video. So all you have to do is to watch this video till the end, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we are going to show you things you need to know when cutting this dress. Today we are going to be cutting this dress that you are seeing in this video. So in case if you are just tuning into my channel, you are welcome. All you have to do is to subscribe to my channel so that you won't miss out in any updates. So this color combination is a chocolate brown and a lime green color. The first step is to place your fabric on fold like this and make sure that the side that is more stretchy is facing sideward like this. Then the side that is less stretchy is facing the overall full length of your dress. Then once you are done, you have to mark out the length of your gown. Like as for me, the length of my gown is 42 inches. I'm not going to add extra hemming allowance. This is because I'm not going to fold the edges. So I'm going to mark exactly 42 inches as the length of my gown. So once you are done marking out the full length of your gown, starting from your shoulder line, you are going to use your ruler to roll it out like this. Then you go for that to mark out your bust point. You know, it's a 16-year-old child's measurement, so it's called bust, no longer chest. So I'm marking out the bust point like this, and I went to mark out the waistline. All the measurement is displayed in this video, so you check it out. Then after marking out the waistline, I had to mark out the hip line for the dress. So after I must have finished marking out the hip line, I went for that to connect it with the ruler like this. So this is the shoulder line, and this is the bust line, this is the waistline, and this is the hip line. So now we are going to go for that and divide our shoulder by 2. Then whatsoever it gives you, you mark it. So the shoulder is 14 inches, divide by 2 is 7 inches. So I mark out the armhole line like this, and the length of the armhole is 8 inches. Then I had to connect it out like this. Then I had to mark out the neck line, and the neck width is 2.5 and the neck depth is 2 inches. This is because it is a turtleneck. Then I'll connect it out like this. So I slop the shoulder by 1 inch and I connect it together like this. I curve the armhole with my free hand. So if you have a curve ruler, you can actually use it. If you don't, you can actually use a free hand like I did. So I decided to locate the midpoint for the front bodice, and I'm going to reduce it by 0.5 inches. This is just for the front bodice. So I connected it like this with a free hand. So I went for that to mark out the bust circumference, divide by 4 plus extra 2 inches. So I mark out the waist circumference, divide by 4 plus extra 2 inches. Then I mark out the hip circumference, divide by 4 plus extra 2 inches. So all the measurements is inside this chart that is displayed in this video. So you have to check it out, the measurement that I'm using for this particular age. So after that, I had to connect it straight like this. So what I'm about to do next is very optional. I want to extend it by 2 inches, like to give in form of a little A-line shape that will connect it to the hip. So if you are making this for a child, there is no need for you to extend it. Just mark it straight and trace it out. But if you are making for an adult, it's just optional. There's no need for this. So I had to extend it. I only extended it by 2 inches like this. Then I'll go for that to trace it out like this. So I'm going to slope the hemline by 1 inch because I do not want it to be too sharp. So after that, I'll cut it out like this. And once I'm done, I'll just mark out my front piece. Then I go for that to cut the back. So I had to place my fabric still on fold, and then I place the front piece on it. So I'm going to use zip for this particular dress, not a button, because it's based on preference. So I'm going to mark out the zip line, which is 1 inch. So I'm going to secure the zipper line for the dress. Then I went further to mark out the neckline. So the back depth is 1 inch. Then I trace it out like this. So I reduced the front armhole by the 0.5 inch that I left while I was marking it. Then I cut it out like this. So I got to indicate my back piece and go ahead to slit the zipper line. So after cutting out your front and back piece like this, you go further and cut out your facing. As I always tell you that you should always make sure that your facing covers the armhole so that you can always use it to turn the armhole. You know, it is a sleeveless dress. So when you are done cutting your facing, the next thing is to mark out the lines that you are going to use to apply your panels. So you first of all start with your front piece. So you pick up your front piece of your dress and open it up like this. Then you turn it to the wrong side. Now look at the style again. You notice that the panels actually reaches the hip line. So what we are going to do is to take note of our hip length by measuring from the shoulder to the hip. So once you take note of your hip length, as for me, the hip length is 22 inches. So I'm just going to take note of the hip length by marking it out like this. Then after marking out the hip length, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. So now once I come down by 1 inch, is now going to be 22 plus 1, that is the hip length, which is 22, plus the 1 inch which I'm going to come down below the hips, which is going to give me 23 inches. So the purpose of adding 1 inch below the hip line is to make sure that the panels does not stop directly on the hip. So this 1 inch will now serve as the midpoint for all the panels that we are going to be adding in this dress. So all the panels will meet directly on that 1 inch line that I just gave. The next thing is for you to mark out your line spacing for your panels. So first of all, I'm going to mark out 1 inch for both sides. This will serve as my seam allowance. Then I'm going to mark out 3/4 of an inch. This is because the main line spacing for this my panels will now be 1.5. So I had to use 3/4 of an inch for the next line, because after I must have joined the side seam, the other 3/4 of an inch will now meet with the other back piece, which will now become 1.5 inches. So the rest of the lines I'm going to be using for my panel spacing is going to be 1.5. So you can as well use 1.5 as your line spacing, or you can use 1 inch or 2 inches, yes, depending on your choice, but it shouldn't be more than 2 inches so that the spacing would not be too wide. So as for me, I'm marking out 1.5 inches as the actual line spacing for my panels. So when you are done marking out all your lines, you connect it to the 1 inch that I gave below the hip line. As I told you earlier on, that the purpose of that 1 inch, it will serve as the meeting point for all your panels. So when you are done marking out your lines for your front piece, you are going to count all the lines to take note of the total numbers so that you'll be able to achieve that same number for the back piece. So once you are done, you slash it like this. Please take note that the total number of lines that you use for the front should always be exactly for the back. So in case if you are using a zip for the back side, you should always divide the line by 2 and make sure that it is exactly the same numbers for the front piece. And if it's more than, you can actually trim it off to be exactly the same numbers. So this is how it looks like after I must have finished slashing out my lines. So when you are done with your front piece, you bring up your back piece and repeat exactly the same process. Like you notice how I mark my hip length and added extra 1 inch below the hip line. So you are going to mark it exactly like that. So you take note of your hip line for your back piece. So as I told you earlier on that my shoulder to the hip line is 22 inches, so I mark it out like this. Then I added extra 1 inch below the hip line. This will serve as the meeting point for all the panels. So you repeat the same process for the back piece like this. So when you are done, you start marking out your lines like I told you earlier on. The exact numbers that you achieve for the front, you repeat it. So you mark out the seam allowance and 3/4 of an inch for joining the back piece and the front piece. Then you mark out 1 inch for your zipper allowance. Remember that I left 1 inch for zipper allowance, so the rest of the lines will be 1.5 inches. Then I got to slash it like this. My sincere apology because I noticed that my camera cut while I was still recording. So you slash out your lines like this. So when you are done slashing all your lines for both the front piece and the back piece, this is how it should look like. So to get the total length of your godets or panels, you are going to bring out your front piece or your back piece and measure from the 1 inch that we gave below the hip line to the full length of your dress. So mine is 19 inches. So I'm going to take note of it, and then I'll add extra 1 inch. So you can as well add extra 1 inch seam allowance or 1.5 inch seam allowance. This is just to avoid shortage while sewing on your main piece. So you are going to place your pattern paper like this on fold and mark it out like this. And the width of my panel is 6 inches. This is because it is placed on fold, and when once I open it up, it's going to be 12 inches. Then I cut it out like this. So the total number of panels that you will be cutting depends on the total numbers of the lines that you have for both front and back piece. So since we are using 2 colors for our panels, all we have to do is to divide the total number of our slash lines by 2. So since mine is 24 as the total number of my slash line, I'm going to divide it by 2, which is 12 slash lines. So I'm going to cut 12 for this particular fabric, then I'll cut another 12 for the other fabric. So you have to pin your pattern paper like this so that you'll be able to trace it out. So after cutting your panels, you open it up like this and continue cutting till you reach the desired number. So since I only need 12 pieces of this panel, I'm going to continue cutting till I reach my desired number, and after that I'll continue cutting with the other color. So when you are cutting yours, you have to be strategic. As you can see, the way I position my pattern paper, you need to position in a way that it will avoid wastage of fabric. So I'm done cutting 12 pieces of this color. So I will go further to cut 12 pieces of this lime green color as I'll be mixing it, and I'll repeat the same process by pinning my pattern paper exactly the way I did in the previous one. So after cutting your panels, this is how it should look like. I have 12 of this chocolate brown and 12 of this lime green. So the last thing that I'll be cutting is our bow. So I'll first of all cut the bow strap, and the length of the bow strap that I'll be cutting is 30 inches plus 1 inch seam allowance. So I'll be cutting total of 31 inches as the length of the bow strap. Then I'm going to mark it out like this. Now, after marking out the length of the bow strap, the next thing is to mark out the width of the bow strap. So I'm going to use 2.5 as the width of the bow strap. Then I'm going to mark it out like this and cut it out. So after cutting your bow strap, this is how it's going to look like. Then I had to go further to place it on fold like this. Then I had to locate the midpoint of my bow. This is just to reduce the size at the center point, so I'm going to slant it like this and trace it out. So at the edge of the bow, I'm still going to slant it by 1 inch, so I'll mark it out like this and trace it out. So the next thing is to cut out our bow, and the length I'll be using is 12 inches and the width is 7 inches. So I'm going to mark it out like this and then cut it out. So we are done cutting the bow, and the length of the bow is not constant and the length of the bow strap is not also constant. It depends on your choice and also the age that you are working on, so you can always reduce it to suit what you want. So every other thing that needs to be cut will be made while sewing this dress. So all you have to do is to subscribe to our channel and click the link that will take you to how we were able to sew this dress. So see you in my next video. Bye.